Hello everyone, today we talk about the organization of lay schools in the Middle Ages. So during the early Middle Ages, schools had been completely almost under the control of the church. I made two videos about this, you can, take a look at if you're curious as an introduction. One is titled Christian Education in the Early Middle Ages, the other one is Literacy in Early Medieval Europe, kind of similar, but they also have different orientations. And so education could be provided fundamentally only by bishoprics, monasteries, and rural parishes in Europe. Only for Italy we have the new that certain lay private schools were present. About the latter we do not know much actually, if not that certain elements of law and also the notary profession was taught, and in the greatest part of the cases, the ecclesiastical schools were of elementary level. So you were taught essentially how to read, how to write, and how to and to count, and only in some of these schools was given higher learning. So programs and methods were largely still the ones that had been refined by Alcuin of York in Carolingian times. So teaching was based on fundamentally the 7 liberal arts that were distinct from the classical authors. In the trivium, there was grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And it entailed that the teacher had to carry out the reading and the comment of a text, which was known as lectio in Latin, hence lecture, right? So it's reading and commenting, and this is typical of medieval education, given that the medievals fundamentally stuck to these models that they naturally considered as the base of a broader interpretation of the world, was founded on them fundamentally. So this reading and analyzing brought to this progressive, naturally, skill in expanding what the intellectual skills, and was very progressive, but it was effective, especially in a world that insisted much on learning by heart, right? At this time, there were people who were simply able to learn the Bible by heart, right? At the time, the material supports to write were very costly. Most people couldn't afford them. By the early Middle Ages, having a book was like having a Ferrari, essentially. There could be it was extremely costly. All the ships that have been butchered in order to create a manuscript. So it was normal to not just transmit culture orally, but naturally also to learn sometimes entire books by heart, which is very convenient, very economic if you want. Given that, of course, that ratio of cost benefits, today obviously things are very different, but we are definitely losing the ability to memorize and in fact to reason, right, on what is told, because if you have something in your head, goes on and you remember it and you can't think on it, and it assumes a deeper meaning, right? It's not just something you learn because it serves to some purpose. It's something that becomes yours, it becomes part of you, right? So especially in these earliest learning systems that appear to be fairly simple, as we've seen, but never underestimate the effect, the amplifying effect that knowing such things by heart could bring to, right? Being able to combine, to make a much deeper intellective effort, right? Not necessarily an intellectual one, but being able to combine certain thoughts, certain ideas simply with your mind, not having them, for example, visualized in front of you on paper or on a screen. So it's particularly important, in my opinion. and we don't have, in fact, to fall into this trap in thinking, okay, well, there were a few relatively few books around, so it was bad, people were ignorant. No, because they actually knew much more than we think. And this didn't really come just from the Christian tradition that naturally is it's the tradition of a book that is central in its sacrality, but at the same time, it's it was all the world from which these people came from, also from not even so distant past, that was based on this. I mean, the ancient knowledge, the general wisdom that surrounded living in a world like that, even knowing things about nature and how to not literally how to survive maybe, but this concept that the world has a deeper meaning that you're deeply tied to, that there is not really a barrier between what you learn and what you live for real, right? That knowledge is not just a convention, but it's actually loaded with certain powers, really. Knowledge is still power, evidently, but at that time it was more than that. Also because certain classes were deputed to be depositories of this knowledge. There is a process, a passage, a transition between, that obviously entails the process of literacy in the middle, that is, from classes like the pagan priesthood that was deputed, in fact, to learn so much about the local traditions and identities and mythologies, etc., that eventually is transferred, albeit in a very hybrid way at the beginning, into this Christian world that is basically the same one that changes, though very, very slowly, into this new into this belief in new religion. So it's something deeper, right? And always think of the Middle Ages not from our own perspective, but from, if anything, the one that came before them, right? Always remember this, that we try to isolate the Middle Ages as a thing on its own, on the base of the meaning that we have wanted to tell us, but to attribute to it, but always think that worlds live about things that have passed, not things that still have to happen, obviously, right? So don't get tricked by the chronological order of events that have already passed, of course, from a long time. And in this sense, be aware, making a comparison with your own state, that you constantly reflect about the past. You obviously reflect about the future, but you can't really deal a lot about the future. Of course, at the time, future was important, especially in the Christian view of time, eschatological ideas that, of course, there is an end of time. There's not a cyclicity like it was before, fundamentally, most of pagan worldviews. So it's definitely important, but it's also something that goes far beyond the strict, say, temporal or physical dimension. It's a deeper and spiritual meaning, right? That at this point is still deeply intertwined with the previous ethos and morals, etc. So never think of the Middle Ages as a moment in which Christianity arrives to destroy essentially what existed before. It's a constant permeation of traditions that exists sometimes even well beyond the Middle Ages, and that coexist constantly with Christianism. And this has nothing to do with, it has in part to do with, obviously, the degrees of Christianization that are incidentally most of the times the degrees of civil development, actually, because that had been since the beginning. Christianity spread more easily through the Roman Empire, then it took more time to go around into Northern Europe, into Eastern Europe, etc. But the concept is that even in the most advanced moments, even in the modern age, there were beliefs that were parallel, that paralleled the Christian one. Think even in modern age about what people thought about alchemy or astrology and all this stuff. It was still this that very strong past, that albeit distant was still alive, and this sense maybe not so distant after all. It was the same thing that had remained there, evidently not erased, not largely demonized as it's thought, especially in the countryside. The countryside always remained without real fear of persecution of these beliefs, largely because these were things that predated by millennia, right? The Christianization and other developments, and largely, the rural societies remained somewhat living the way that they had always been doing. So as long as the Christian needs were pretty simple, as long as there was no new heresy that rose to challenge the elites of the Christian society, everything was accepted, right? Also because objectively paganism didn't have any chance, didn't stand any chance as a system of it was not even probably a system of beliefs. It was a system of rituals, right? So Christianity was perfectly compatible with it at a certain level, but it also didn't represent any challenge to Christianity in itself, right? Because it simply belongs to a world that, in the moment in which it can't sustain not much Christianity in itself, but the structures that expand together with Christianity, that society has already evolved at that stage, that is able to accept the need for a higher for a more structured philosophical religious system, right? So this is maybe a digression, but it's still important to remember, because when you think of education, that wasn't something so mediated and pragmatic and utilitaristic, let's say, as we intended today. Today I take a degree because I need that work. At the time it was very different, and it was much freer, if you want. And telling the truth, Christian education, as we noticed also in the previous videos, was actually pretty open. Like at this time during the early Middle Ages, basically everybody could enter into Christian schools, and it's pretty interesting because even the lay could enter, as we'll see now as well. Even though this is typical of the earliest Middle Ages, right? Things start to be a bit more complicated when the same society, especially in say from Carolingian times onwards, stratifies more, for which education becomes relatively more elitary, and it entails much, not a matter of strict education, but also of adherence to certain political and social diktat that is that requires a certain part of society to contribute to that rather than another. But generally speaking, Christian education at large had always a space for whoever could opt for learning. And I don't think that at the time the fact that a few people were educated was a matter of oppression, that someone was preventing them from learning. Simply is that they had to have a reason for doing that. Education had to be sustained in some way. There were limited funds for doing it, so sometimes it was much more profitable to be a peasant, a farmer, a trader, or a craftsman, rather than a learned person. Also because education was really not for everybody, meaning that as simple as certain things can appear to us, there were certain evident limits in general in, say, intrinsic capacity or need or of even acceptance of learning. There were a few people who could effectively reach certain positions because of the numerical limit of those positions. So it's obvious that in medieval Europe, nobody, the opportunity to obtain those places was so was so low that, okay, everybody could get kind of this minimal education of literacy, but for what that could serve, not necessarily was convenient, right? Maybe it was better to set them starting to keep working your land, right? So this is an important difference, because it's an economical principle. It's based on how many places there are that can be occupied, right? So that everybody can learn that minimal, but that minimal is not going to make a lot of difference in that world. So only higher forms of education that naturally required much more resources were, of course, capable of, differentiating, even socially speaking, other people and the people within each other, and to even make a change within the same society, as we will see with certain figures of dramatic importance. We mentioned before Al-Kwharizmi of York, right? So, and we have to think that one problem looking at early medieval education is that sometimes we don't really know what these people knew at the time in the first place. Like, sources are so scanty that the impression is superficially something like, there is a few because essentially nobody studied. Well, this is really, nobody learned, nobody cared about that, but this is not correct. If you go a bit deeper into this field, you realize that more than studying less, we simply don't have sources to tell us how much people learned and on the base of what. So as I was saying before, never underestimate what was learned visually, also orally, and what was known in general about the world at the time, because it was probably a much more intellectually dynamic world than we're probably willing to accept. And this myth that the Middle Ages essentially were pure ignorance combined is simply not realizing that these judgments are based on what we think it is knowledge today and how it should be delivered. While at the time such experiences went beyond such categorizations. It was more a matter of leaving the world than learning about the world, which is very important. It would be of great importance even today, because the way we deal with knowledge today is very aseptic, right? Sometimes it becomes sterile. That is, we can be presented with very meaningful information, but we're able to frame it in terms of linguistical code, but we're not able to understand from a deeper, let's say, as a deeper wisdom, right? And that's why medieval people were so hungry for knowledge. Like there is never been this is something I always say. There's never been an age, historically speaking, in which people were more thirsty of knowledge in the first place, like the Middle Ages. Like, not even once. Because the Romans, the ancient world, had a completely different approach. Basically, the Greeks were mostly about theoretical speculations with very few applications. The Romans were, instead, the contrary, very few intellectual development, but a lot of practical application. The Enlightenment is basically more concerned about not about learning in itself, but in setting the frame in which knowledge can be categorized. Medieval history, and also part of early modern culture, is deeply rooted in this enormous, incredible fascination with knowledge and the concept of knowledge in itself. So as you see, this is very different than thinking, Middle Ages equates ignorance, right? Or people were dumb or stupid, or of course, we know we don't have to be so romantic in the first place. We know, even if we remember at contexts that we know better from a few generations ago, we know what ignorance can do. But we know also the the different attitude towards life that derives from such way of looking at the world, which is not necessarily better or worse, but it's simply different and based on the possibilities that those people had. And we would have a lot of problems in adapting ourselves to those worlds because with those means, because we were used to live with different means, which doesn't which in that world you wouldn't be able to find, but simply because you wouldn't need them, given the technological potential what is out there, and this myth of eternal progress and of modern wisdom and the contrast between darkness and light in terms of education. It's probably very challengeable, and there are certain concepts that every anthropologist actually knows about. The different perceptions of time, of places, of characteristics that they have. They're simply different mental systems, and we will probably never know what, I don't know, a 7th century, I don't know, Anglo-Saxon farmer thought in his life. But it's still important to acknowledge that for what we can know, that was something very different, and yet at the same time very intelligent for their own times, right? These people were they were very pragmatically oriented, for example. They didn't quite have a real need for theoretical thinking, right? This is something that we actually didn't have up to 100 years ago. Nobody cared about hypotheses. What if something was like that, and what for? What was the normal answer? That was the attitude, right? Or think about this thing, this imaginary element. They say, but I've never seen it, so why would I imagine it? And how could I imagine it? And what for? And it does make sense. And for us, it doesn't anymore, because we have reversed this balance actually, so that we are very theoretically versed, but we're not very practically versed anymore. It will be always like increasingly like that. I'm sure at one point, there's not very far in time, we will have to teach children how to do certain things that, I don't know, even us as kids used to do. Our parents or grandparents that were, practically oriented in certain, playing with toys or going outside, kicking, playing football, stuff like that, and that will be here much more, that will be lost in a certain sense. So, and we change very fast. Like, never think. Also, this helps to understand education in this perspective, that such things didn't quite change because there was a tremendous effort to adapt human mind to them, right? Never underestimate the adaptation capability of human minds. It's something that we do constantly. Science tells this to us, that is basically we are radically prejudiced about our ability of changing and adapting, mentally speaking. And so the real change is not about culture. It's not that our civilization emerged because someone came with some books people learned and they started evolving, right? It's the other way around. Books were written in different ways because the base, politics, society were changing, right? So it's not a matter of inferiority, but on the contrary, it's an achievement of those same societies to have arrived in the way we are. So we're not the ones who made a favor to them, because think about it, this is the general attitude. We feel better. We feel like patronizing towards these people, like saying, they were a bunch of savages. I would be able to educate them and to tell them what to do, to try to live in the moment in the way they did. you would die, and they probably, they would be the only people who would be probably who would be able to help you, with all of your knowledge, but you would be able to do a very few in that world. So, and we could let's say, on and on, because there is much more to add to this, like pretending that you can't survive out there, applying modern technology. On which spin-off exactly? How can your technology serve your technological knowledge serve someone who someone who lives in the 7th century? Well, of course, there are certain things you can try to apply, but without spin-off, that would soon be anti-economic. Like, it would be better to just do what everybody was doing at the time, because guess what? That was the best thing you could do at the time, right? So never think you're more intelligent or more capable than someone who lived 1,000 years ago, right? Never, because it's very stupid, and this has been acknowledged from quite some time now. let's reverse this idea. And naturally, there's also this other prejudice that the medievals had somewhat forgotten or depreciated classical culture, right? This is not true. Like, certain knowledge was lost, and there is no doubt about this, sometimes even massive amounts of knowledge. The problem is understanding what that knowledge served to, once again. And if you look at medieval education, medieval literature in general, broadly meant, let's say, you realize that there's never been a single moment, historically speaking, in which medievals haven't kept in mind what the classical world had done, and that had never, had ever gone astray from that. Of course, there were other traditions, as we were saying before, from a non-classical past as well, especially in certain regions of Europe. But in general, thinking that, for example, the classical knowledge was kind of rediscovered. It is true when we talk about single works, but not as a general understanding of what reality was, right? You could think, things like, looking at Roman ruins, that people in the early Middle Ages believed that, there had the only giants could build them. But, can we be actually sure that they fully believed, or that they that was the prevalent position, or that they didn't know there had been a past to which, things could be very different from what they had actually been, but that they regarded as valuable, right? That they understood they were coming from. Now, this would be an interesting question to answer. Maybe this one would surprise even on the basis of what I'm trying to say, basically, because, surely not everybody knew that there had been something like Rome, or but in a Christian perspective, this, for example, was acknowledged. At least the elites knew that for obvious reasons, because they studied on the basis of those works, and they were talking about the ancient Greeks, Alexander, Romans, Caesar, Augustus, Constantine more than others, because he was the Christian, allegedly the first Christian emperor, and so on. So it was definitely understood, even at the time, there had been something else for which they had partially decayed, right? Also in here, early medieval times were indeed, poorer and kind of more primitive than certain parts of the ancient world, certain moments of the ancient world. But we have to be careful also with these comparisons, because this is not true everywhere. In another certain times, and still there is a big difference even between the same areas of Europe, right? The Middle Ages is not a homogeneous flatland where everybody that's the same level. There are massive differences, if anything, by on the basis of climatic differences of different latitude, in this sense, different locations in terms of location on, I don't know, trade routes and contacts. There is the world of the city, the world of the countryside, and many other things. So always diversify because it's easier, right? In regard of what you can think of these worlds like, then of course even having an excess of differentiation is probably not useful, because these were still somewhat similar societies, right? Then of course the study of the trivium, the quadrivium, also the classical orders, was aimed in general in a Christian world to a better comprehension of the Holy Scriptures, right? As we were saying before, this great effort of understanding the world was framed into a religious duty. And this idea that the world, the universe, was, not something random, that had a sense, it was the same creation, and in this sense, mankind had the duty to decipher and to investigate. This is also very important. It was not a passive acceptance of the world as it was, like saying, okay, stay in here, let's be just subject to God's will, let's not do anything about it. The world was seen as a great symbol to be deciphered. And this didn't necessarily have to pass through what we call science, but it was, a broader concept that had to do, that also science obviously takes into consideration today, but our science is much more factually oriented, meaning that the theoretical aspect of it is definitely important, but it requires naturally a testing, right? In the Middle Ages, it wasn't quite like that. There was also a lot of strictly theoretical speculation. It was very important to put an order in order to interpret this state of existence in the first place. And naturally, this was done on the basis of the scriptures, which is a very different thing naturally from modern science. But there were also scientific interests, strictly meant, that were left also by the classical world, but that this time was mostly Isidore of Seville, of his Christian Encyclopedia. That everything you had to know was basically contained in them. So this is important because from one side you can see it as a limiting factor, like saying that there had been a religious authority that had, and virtue, by the way, not much of his strict ecclesiastical authority, but also because of his culture as an individual. This is very important because in Christian world there is this distinction from quite the beginning. At the same time, there was the idea that there had been minds that had been able to cover such a large knowledge, right? And that there were boundaries within which you had to explore a knowledge that was out of reach of many people in that form at the time. So it gave you the security of a perimeter, but at the same time this perimeter was large enough to leave you enough room in a lifetime to explore by those times means, right? So of course the Middle Ages was a moment in which knowledge expanded beyond what even the classical one had been, and where you can't find really a qualitative, let's say that large part, basically the Middle Ages remain largely at the level of the ancient world. We can't talk about this. Things start to change, in my opinion, soundly by the 13th century. At that point, there is a a quantitative surpass rather than a qualitative surpass. That science also evolved relatively few. There were certain improvements, but the essentials, technologically speaking, were always the same. But there was one element that eventually will create from the Middle Ages in itself the same Renaissance, which is this ability of combining the ancient knowledge and its authorities, both from the Christian and also the pagan world, because that was true as well. As long as this had been the latter had been integrated into Christian science, that was this. I don't know even how to say that, but let's say enrichment, this vivification of knowledge through reinterpretation. And this is particularly evident with in the 13th century the great universal systematizations that derive from especially Aristotelism, that derives from the Islamic world, that had combined it with other ideas, Persian culture, Indian culture, and these Hellenistic traditions that had enriched them, had expanded them. In fact, the Aristotle that arrived in Europe, and on which even the scholastics was based eventually with Thomas Aquinas, etc., was not properly Aristotle. It was something different, right? It was Avicenna that had mediated it. So, and by mediating it, had let's say given a subtler and a deeper interpretation of it. This is important. There is obviously a philosophical improvement in the moment in which someone has produced a work and someone else reads it and studies it, and for a long time, right? Because maybe the authority was great for having created such a work that before had never existed, like it had happened in the ancient world. But then there is a medieval author that, in this sense, is already at that at his level, and is able to commit his own resources as an individual in order to expand that knowledge, to apply it to the world that he knows, and that through its combinations can provide a deeper, a more sensible and critical understanding of the same work, right? So this is really what, when the people from the Renaissance were thinking that they were essentially finally arrived to copy the Romans and the Greeks that they conceived as the best thing ever happened, they were actually already beyond the Romans and the Greeks thanks to medieval civilization. Renaissance is not there is this touch of really sensibility that derives from the Middle Ages that is already additional in the value of the classical past. It is never literally copied. It's enriched by what medieval civilization had accomplished. So coming back on the Holy Scriptures, of course, the attention towards the studies, it's obvious, because the schools, even being albeit being also opened to external students as laymen, were chiefly destined to the clergy, right, to the ecclesiastical education. And therefore, after the Bible, of course, there was a further complement, higher learning that dealt with theology strictly meant. So biblical exegesis, and also here on the base of the Christian authorities, but that was essentially the implementation of this criticism of the texts. Mm-hmm. And this is very useful because different Christian, the fathers of the church had sometimes even, different ideas, right? There were different cultures, different perspectives. Even think about before the schism of the 11th century, how, Eastern and Western Christianity had gone differentiating, right? The importance that Augustine had in the West, and importance that Basil the Great had in the East. So also in here, the being acquainted to a text that is already complex, because the Bible objectively is not easy to understand, but also to certain commentators that with the classical intellectual tools are able to criticize, to make a biblical exegesis, and then studying all these various thinkers and what they had come up with is very useful, because it already presents you with a solid base of different critical systems that you can combine to have something else. So at the beginning of the 12th century, many great monastic schools that had previously carried out this prestigious role were decaying. This was happening chiefly because, especially within the cities, it was witnessed the multiplication of the lay schools under the push of this demand for education that came from the new writing groups. This is a great change that naturally was very progressive, but nevertheless very, very felt, even at the same moment, because, and can be observed a bit as the general crisis that exists within the feudal world, the rural world, because of the rise of the cities that are more competitive, concentrate more resources, more knowledge, more know-how, and capacities, also technical capacities. This is very, very, very important. So this is a problem that invests also politics, because the new monarchies that are rising at this point need skilled, scientists, craftsmen, and people of knowledge in general. So especially these lay schools start becoming very valuable assets that are producing new innovative models that are way more effective than what the usual capitulary schools or monastic schools had been about, right? There is a crisis even that you can witness a few days ago. No, well, not. I didn't make still, but the rise of a lay culture is very important, right? Because what we read, in fact, for a long time throughout all the Middle Ages is the clerical perspective. So that even the term clerk comes from Middle Ages, in the sense that in the Middle Ages only the clergy was educated usually for offices that even were carried out in the administration, etc. Also in here, the differences between various areas of Europe are very important. Like tendentially, the presence of a clergy remains much longer in the north of Europe, while in the south, the rise of this very entrepreneurial and dynamic classes brings very soon to a great transformation. So this perception of knowledge, of education, and even the way history is told, because naturally, it makes a great difference if history is written by a monk or by a layman. And because of different experiences that they have, different models that they are taught, different lifestyles that they lead, basically. But has influenced the various national historiographies and even certain bias towards certain types of sources, right? In the north of Europe, chroniclers are not very appreciated or considered trustworthy. In southern Europe, chronicles, for example, are a massive part of historical of the historical object, and this is important because certain areas of Europe had always remained kind of literate, right? In places like Italy, even the countryside was partly literate. Also in here, why? Well, aside from the fact that, of course, it was a richer place, and there were more connections, more cities, etc. But in fact, the same countryside had always been tied to the city. It's not like in other areas of Europe where you find the world of the forest that is completely isolated. There are communities that live completely outside of what the urban world is, because they're self-sufficient. So there are completely different views of the world, and naturally, in these southern European lands, the general development of these forms of education is higher. Even think about Spain as well. The importance that Muslim presence had, the school of Toledo, that after the Reconquistas also, Christians went there to get educated along the frontier, trying to find these Arab books, this translation from ancient sources, etc. And eventually the translation school of Toledo, where all people from all over Europe came to study in order to copy books to bring them home. Think about even the Byzantine East and all the deep cultural tradition that it had maintained, even as an identifying feature, and distinguishing feature of Byzantine culture. So it's very important to look at this process, and it's very easy to explain, because simply these communities now had way more need to learn, right? If you live in a city that starts making an enormous amount of money through sea trade and has to manage them, has to invest them, but it's obvious that you need people who need to write and how to manage all this stuff. Why does the Renaissance starts in Italy, according to you? Because books arrived from the Byzantine refugees after the Ottoman advance. This thing has started centuries before. It was because of the needs that all that wealth that had been capitalized had to be administered and employed and invested, and all the wealth, the development of other professions and their interaction. Notaries, notary law, but probably the greatest pivot in European culture at this point is law, is the recovery of Roman law, the first universities of Bologna, the need for the Holy Roman Emperors to hire these jurists to back their prerogatives, the clash for investitures, what did the popes wanted to stress as their prerogatives, and what the Holy Roman Emperors did. The internal struggles. These are all things that produce civilization, and this is why certain areas produce certain things and others don't, right? So it's obviously a different degree of it, but something that accelerates very, very, very fast, especially from the 12th century onwards. I think I made a video about this stuff also. Let me check. Translation. Let me check a second. I can't tell you. This video is 12th century Western translation from Greek and Arabic. Scientific revival of the West, 10th to 13th century, point of medieval technology is very important. The 12th century Renaissance and introduction. There is also this one, organization of medieval universities. There is this other video, since we will name Gerbert of Aurillac, and the school of Chartres. These are very important topics and are very, very, very overlooked. Yeah. And excuse me, here I have some problem. Okay, here we go. So big change. Like objectively, you can't have a realistic picture of medieval history if you don't pass through these concepts here, because these are not secondary aspects of that civilization. These are fundamental aspects of that civilization. This is literally how that world was developing on those bases, because that are both cause and consequence of this expansion. So the relatively to lay schools, we do not. I mean, we know that these were rising, right? Very fast. They already existed since several centuries. It's likely that, especially in certain regions of Europe, that schools had never died out from the ancient world onwards. These lay schools. That's why we made the example of Italy before, because objectively that's the land where we can track this continuity. However, there is this gap for which we do not have explicit evidence. Say explicit. I mean, the sources speaking about these things explicitly, if not starting from the beginning of the 13th century. So the growth of lay schools appears indirectly witnessed by certain regulations of the Lateran Council of 1179 that manifest the worry of the church for the competition that they were posing to the same ecclesiastical schools, right? So in these regulations it was stressed that the cathedral chapters were obliged to maintain a school, and it was disposed that in this school could be accepted also laymen. So here even higher learning is opening, explicitly and necessarily, formally actually, because this had evidently already began in some way, because there was a request now, a quest for knowledge, for education. These were all these laymen that were needing to access the higher learning that the church had as well. So we're in a very advanced time. We're not still in the early Middle Ages, where it didn't make a great difference whether you were difference if someone wanted to be educated. Now there were important issues going on, including, as we were saying before, the struggle for investitures, for which the church wanted to maintain part also the control on the on the people that they were educating, because if you were educated by the church and then you went serving the emperor, that was contexting the church's prerogatives, well, the papal prerogatives, let's say better, that was a big deal, right? But it's evident that everything was mixed since the beginning. We know, but this is not just a matter of education, strictly speaking. It's also a matter of, for example, employment. Like, it was plenty of laymen that were working in these schools, and that not being educated in there, but doing, I don't know, writing illuminated manuscripts, for example, or just working there as skilled laymen that were sometimes even paid with education, right, and other special privileges attached to that institution, stuff like that. So, and it's very interesting that the church is worried about the spread, however, of lay schools that has evidently already happened. And the way schools and universities, at the end of the day, in the beginning, it's not there is no distinction proper, is something very spontaneous, right? We haven't been talking excessively about the birth of medieval universities. Before I mentioned to you one of the videos I made on it, but I shall tell a lot more. But universities were founded, they weren't the solid foundations that you can find in the 14th century, already well stratified and consolidated with an internal oligarchy and organization, etc., and a crystallization of even of the teaching by certain standards. But with an ideological control. The first universities in the 11th century, in the 12th century, are just literally a master that is a private no one that has a knowledge because he knows how to write, has found books of law, has started studying them, and other private no ones that pay this master, for this person, for teaching them, so that he becomes eventually a master for them, and it's very autonomous, very spontaneous. And it's often overlooked because eventually these models were exported a little bit, even especially in the center and north of Europe, on the models that had already been born elsewhere, especially by that are exported by, say, imported better by the monarchies that understood what the potential of this stuff was. But in other regions, it had spread like crazy at this point. Like every city has something like that, multiple schools, tens of schools. So, and these schools are extremely precious because they are born for society that needs notaries, who needs lawyers, who needs other teachers and grammarians, etc. But the very soon the elites start needing these human resources. They need people who know how to read and write and who know the law, who can work for them. So they become extremely important assets that for which there is all this competition, for example, between the elites. There are universities that are founded by the emperor, others that are founded by the pope, others that are founded by themselves, essentially, because they emerged as free universities in some cities, and there is a spread throughout all of Europe, and it means that universities attract money and people. There are people who come living in the city, who consume, who pay taxes, tolls, and there are actually some bonuses for university students. The universities are called universities because a university in the Middle Ages is the name was used for society. So since there was no centralized state, the whole world was built by universities. Like guilds, corporations were called universities. The world, the universalistic ideal is still there. It's a corporativistic, essentially, a view of the world where there is every community that kind of organizes itself in these corporations and asks recognition from the government for it. So, but making students come there. So the universities have their own internal laws, for example, their internal privileges and tax exemptions, and the more there are, the more students there are, and the more money comes there, in the city, wherever. And there are some problems sometimes as well. There are ferocious competitions even between different schools, different universities, different groups, national groups, right? People came from everywhere to go studying universities like Bologna or Paris, that are the most important one. The Italian one is for law, the French one is for theology. But there are many. Think about Montpellier in southern France or other many important centers. So it's really a big phenomenon that it's all intertwined, by the way, at this point with ecclesiastical matters. For example, the beginning of the 13th century was the problem of educating the Franciscans that had entered into, had been accepted as a mendicant order, but they had to be framed because there were many and they needed an organization, but they were poor and ignorant, and therefore they needed to be educated. So there were all conventions with the universities of theology, and there were enormous political problems gravitating around these dynamics that now we can't explain one by one, but it's such a ferment of ideas. This is the century. These are the centuries of the heresies as well, because through these centers of a higher learning, definitely there are pretty disturbing things happening. In terms of heterodoxy, that cause a lot of problems for the church, right? So, and they do start sometimes from this very high learning, right? Many heresies start from definitely the lower strata of the populations, but some of them are actually starting from the elite, the educational elites, right? We made some videos about this stuff. Like I made a video, in fact, about Amalric of Benin and the Age of the Spirit. This is the title. It's very important. Amalric had been this French philosopher and theologian, teacher at University of Paris. Basically, when he was that, he had problems with the church at that point because of the problem that he had refused. He had rejected. He had declared he was not an heretic. But after a while, the heresy broke out after he was dead, and it was discovered that most of his students his pupils were the ones that now were spreading the error. These were big problems. That's also why, at the end of the day, the church decides to integrate the Aristotle after having forbidden it. But it was so successful in these environments that it couldn't be stopped. So you know what? Let's integrate it in in the system of Christian Science, right? So very important processes here that in turn function spreading further knowledge. Like, because if you have to counter an heretic movement that is already kind of autonomous thinking from orthodoxy, you have to produce another, you have to extend orthodoxy into another field in order to cope with that ideology. That's what the Dominicans are built for. The Dominicans are this task force of educated friars that were to counter the Cathars in southern France. So these are the basis of our, of our Christianity, meaning that Dominicans, Franciscans still here. So these are important cultural paths. And in the same Lateran Council of 1179, it was added that the bishops had to grant freely, for free, the licentia docenti, that is essentially the permission to teach. That was achieved at the end of the studies to anyone who had asked it. So this was an implicit recognition of the unsatisfactory role of capillary schools in front of the multiplication, chiefly of the students, right? So there was a need now even to expand the number of the same schools, because more and more people needed education. This was a pretty ferocious struggle to bring under your education as many as possible that otherwise would go somewhere else. So since the 13th century, we have more information about private lay schools that are kept by certain masters, certain teachers that are hired with contracts. And sometimes we're called even to teach at home. There's a lot of homeschooling, right? Which is great, actually, because I wish I had been homeschooled rather than having had to go to school every single day for how many years? 13 years. It's quite a big deal, right? To have someone, obviously only who could afford such form of education was could do it, but it's symptomatic of a much deeper need of education than ever before, right? And the school curriculum entailed, before the access to university, 3 levels of school, right? So in order to go to university, you objectively needed this, say, formal education. It's not very different from our own. We also have 3 grades, 3 levels of school. So certain things never change really. The first one was represented by, say, elementary school, basic school, that in turn was articulated in other 2 or 3 levels, in the course of which it was taught how to write, how to read and how to write, of course. And it was given a first knowledge of Latin as well. Everything was in Latin at the time. Yes, of course, this is the moment in which also vernacular starts spreading, but in certain regions it's still not a library. Yeah, well, it's starting now actually to be a literary language as well. But it's not so frequent like Latin, of course, and serious professions, let's say, were based on Latin in this sense, especially law, as you can imagine, but also theological studies, of course. And then there was grammar school. This is the second level of school. School of Grammar, also known the School of the Latinantes, which means literally those who are learning Latin, right? The Latinans, that would be. To which was taught grammar, Latin grammar actually, and the composition through transcriptions and translations. So you were taught theory and practice of Latin. Then there was the third level of school that is actually less studied, because evidently it was a bit of like our high school. It's probably more complicated to track even in the programs and how it was actually structured, right? And that instead, however, was centered importantly on the trivium and the quadrivium. So it was really opening at university teaching, a bit like high school objectively still is today, right? So the quest for culture that came from the world of artisans and the merchants brought to the creation of specific professional schools, such as the abacus school. The abacus is this checkered tablet that allowed to execute accounting through the help of certain little discs of different color. Even children have still today. I had it when I was a kid for playing, more like a toy. I actually had a calculator, but a digital one. You know, it's still funny to move all the various rings, and through which, in fact, calculus was taught, and even complex ones, like fractions, variables, and interests, and discounts, and stuff like that. So the abacus school was attended chiefly by the sons of merchants, right? So those who essentially completed their education after the first level of school into the shops and in the warehouses where they learned the craft. So in the 12th century, the mathematical knowledge of the West progressed a lot, right? Chiefly thanks to the contact with Arab culture and the circulation in Europe of translation from Arabic, of Greek texts, as I was mentioned to you before. There is that video, is essentially about that. And we're talking about works like the Elements of Euclides and of certain properly Arab texts, such as the Algebra of Al-Kwharizmi. This was this Islamic mathematician that had lived in the 9th century, and that basically, Al-Kwharizmi is the same name from which algorithm comes, and was dramatically important for medieval mathematics in general, and a massive contribution to the development of maths up to fundamentally the early modern age came from the Pisan Leonardo Fibonacci, that as a kid had studied. He was the son of a merchant, so he traveled a lot, and he had studied maths in Algeria, where he was together with his father. That was a notary for the commune of actually for the merchants of Pisa, right? So these are men that were deeply involved into this strictly economical activities, and that had also this broader education and access to these works, scientific works, when they went abroad trading from Europe. So Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, so literally the book of the abacus, is dated to 1202, contributed to the spread in the West of the zero, right? And of the numeration system that today we call Arab, but that actually was born in India. And in fact, the same Fibonacci talks about Indian numbers, not Arab numbers. And this new numerals was actually already known in the West since the end of the 10th century, thanks to the works of Schwerpunkt of Aurillac. There was this French monk that will become famously Pope with the name of Sylvester II, but also an important mathematician and passionate intellectual that allowed, since the Middle Ages, this new chances in the development of counting, right? As we were saying before, we made some videos about Schwerpunkt of Aurillac. Wait a second. I can give it a title. Yes, there's two videos. The one I had already told you, Schwerpunkt of Aurillac and the School of Chartres, and the other one, the Roman Church and Schwerpunkt of Aurillac. That apparently have been watched as videos, interestingly enough. So yeah, and if you want to know a bit more about him, he had started having a truly universal knowledge for, it's very complicated actually to explain now, but had to do with this omnicomprehensive knowledge that the church was acquiring at the time. The Church of Rome, especially in this broader taste for the universalistic ambitions over the same church and empire as well, but there is all the connection with the Ottonian emperors, etc. So a lot was being achieved, and you realize that this intellectual development started much earlier than we are used to think. The same Gerbert had gone to Spain to take those Arabic books for translating them and knowing more, and these influences actually arrived deep into even southern France, where he was from. So there's a lot to know about these figures, and realizing that all the stories deeply interconnected. I remember when I started making these videos, I remember someone saying, not here on YouTube, but around where I shared the videos, that I don't know, like the Middle Ages is this black pit where nothing happens, and if knowledge does not exist and people did not read, books were always just stored and nobody opened them until the Renaissance, right? This is the real Middle Ages, and we have a big deal of duty to take it back, like to take back this deeper vision of reality and of the world, the universe that they had at the time. It's very difficult. On Schwerpunkt, I will try to do it more frequently to expand on these topics, but it's important, first of all, to have this general elements, this essential points to stick to, so that you can orientate yourself better. And to me, it's terribly useful as well. So, all right, for now, we stop here. I hope, as usual, that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.